I'm so nervous.
No, you're gonna do awesome.
All right, thanks everyone for tuning into this last discussion. We're gonna get started on this next panel. It's gonna be the fourth and final panel. I see some individuals are speaking, so please make it out to the foyer if you want to continue your conversations. But for the sake of time, we will get started here very shortly.
Are they gonna sit down?
I think a lot of people are going to talk to Nick.
Oh yeah. Oh well, then I can't film in front of that many people. Wait, what?
You're so good. Hey, you do awesome.
Can I start? Hello, my name is Carolyn Russell, and I'm currently a fourth-year student at the college and a staff writer for the Chicago Thinker. I'm honored to introduce our speakers and our moderator for today's panel on America's role in the world. First, we have Paul Poast, an associate professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Professor Poast is also a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and World Affairs columnist for World Politics Review. His research focuses on international relations, alliance politics, methodology, and political economy of security. We also have Robert Pape, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Professor Pape is a leading scholar on international security affairs, and his research focuses on coercive air power, political violence, and terrorism. Professor Pape is the author of several influential books, including Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, and Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War. Over video chat, we have Curt Mills, who serves as the executive director of the American Conservative. Curt Mills has previously worked at the National Interest, U.S. News and World Report, Washington Examiner, and The Spectator. He is an expert in foreign policy and campaign coverage, and his work often explores the intersection of politics and national strategy. Unfortunately, Paul Wolfowitz could not make it in person, but he has provided a pre-recorded video. Paul Wolfowitz served as the 10th president of the World Bank, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia, and Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He is an expert in American foreign policy with decades of experience in government and academia. Today's panel will be moderated by Henry Smith, a third-year student pursuing a joint bachelor and master's degree in political science and international relations. He currently serves as the managing editor of the Chicago Journal of Foreign Policy and is also a Marcellus Policy Fellow at the John Quincy Adams Society. Thank you all for being here. Please join me in welcoming our speakers and our moderator.
All right, this is on. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, to our professors for coming. Thank you all for joining our panel on America's role in the world. We are living through, undoubtedly, one of the most fluid and uncertain moments in international affairs since the end of the Cold War. The unipolar moment that followed the Soviet Union's collapse has decisively passed, and American primacy, military, economic, ideological, is no longer assumed. Across multiple regions, challengers to the US-led order are growing more assertive. China is expanding its influence in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Russia is actively attempting to redraw borders in Europe, and regional powers such as Iran and North Korea continue to defy international norms with increasing sophistication. But this is not a return to bipolarity or the familiar clarity of the Cold War. The landscape today is multipolar, fragmented, and ideologically ambiguous. Economic interdependence and technological diffusion have made the world more tightly connected and yet still more strategically unstable. The rules and institutions that once underpinned the post-Cold War international system are under pressure. Some of these strains come from external challengers. Others stem from within the West itself, where confidence in the liberal order has faltered and where governments, including the current US administration, are reevaluating core assumptions about American leadership. What exactly is happening in U.S. foreign policy at the moment remains a matter of debate. Some see it as a necessary correction and adaptation to the new realities of power, competition, and domestic constraint. Others see it as a retreat from the commitments that once provided stability to the world. And yet still others argue that American power is being recalibrated, not diminished, but restructured toward a different model of international engagement. The answer is not mine to give, nor do I have it, but it is clear that the world is growing more contested, and the United States must make hard choices in response. At the same time, it would not at all be an understatement to say that the domestic foundation for American foreign policy has fractured. The public's appetite for international engagement is at best uncertain, shaped by 2 decades of war, economic dislocation, and political polarization. There is no longer a single bipartisan consensus about what American leadership means, or whether it should even remain a central goal. The strategic debate has moved from think tanks and journals to the center of the political discourse, and there are voices variously calling for different types of strategies. This panel will not be about relitigating the past. It is about the present and the near future. What should America's role in the world be today? What should it be tomorrow and 1 year from now? Insofar as we may not yet know the full contours of the world to come, what kind of strategic framework should guide our decisions in the moment? Is today the time that demands a new X article from a modern George Kennan, or is it too early for that kind of foresight? To explore these questions, I'm joined by 3 thinkers with distinct and serious perspectives. Each brings a different lens on the use of force, the role of alliances, the balance between restraint and engagement, and meaning of national interest in today's world. And our discussion on these topics will unfold in 3 parts. First, we will start with strategic ends. What objectives should U.S. foreign policy be pursuing in the current international landscape? Is the goal to maintain global leadership, to protect vital interests, to promote democracy, or, as George Washington said, to avoid entanglement altogether? Second, we'll examine means and instruments. What tools should the U.S. prioritize in pursuit of its goals? Are alliances still our greatest strength, or are they constraints? How should we think about sanctions, trade policy, forward military presence, and diplomatic engagement? And third, limits and trade-offs. What are the risks of doing too much? What are the risks of doing too little? At a time when we have competing priorities in a world of American limited influence, how do we make these choices? And how, if at all, do domestic, economic, and political constraints shape the ambitions that we set abroad? With that, I'd like to introduce a set of recorded remarks from former Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz on America's role in the world.
Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you this evening for these short remarks. For over 2 centuries, the most important role of American leadership in the world has been to keep our own people safe and prosperous. That has not changed over the years. What has changed is what needs to be done in practice and amid changing circumstances to achieve that goal. In his famous 1796 farewell address, President George Washington warned of the dangers of entangling alliances. He was speaking during the time of the Napoleonic Wars of imperial conquest, and when the French Revolution devolved into a reign of terror. His caution made sense for a young republic that was vulnerable, and still at a time when Britain and France continued to meddle on this continent through the instrument of armed proxies. But Washington's words were rooted in circumstances, not doctrine, in prudence, not isolation. As America has grown in strength, our responsibilities evolved, and so did threats from overseas. But fortunately, so also did our country's ability to deter those challenges. In 1838, a very young Abraham Lincoln, not yet 30, offered a different kind of warning. He said that if danger ever reached us, it would not come from distant shores. It would arise from within. He was speaking about division among Americans, about anarchy, and the erosion of the rule of law. His message still resonates in our time. Today we are tested on both fronts. We face confusion and uncertainty at home, but also rising threats from abroad. We are now confronted from an axis of tyrants China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. 4 tyrannical regimes which share a common interest in weakening the United States, in dividing our allies, and in dismantling the principles that underpin a free and peaceful international order. China is the most powerful of the 4, with economic power and advanced technology can exercise influence within our country, which previous dictatorships could only dream of. What starts in China won't necessarily stay in China. That country seeks regional dominance throughout the Indo-Pacific, global influence through economic coercion, and ideological control within its own borders. It crushes dissent in Hong Kong and threatens Taiwan and exports surveillance technologies to tyrannical regimes around the world. Most of all, it seeks to crush those political institutions which could demonstrate to its own subjects that there are democratic alternatives to China's one-party tyranny. It focuses particularly on Taiwan and Hong Kong because they are geographically close and also because they share important elements of common culture. But nothing could better serve the long-term interests of China's one-party government than to weaken and destabilize the United States, its most important global competitor. This is not a replay of the Cold War. Today's circumstances are very different, but it is a confrontation between open societies and closed ones, between nations that believe in the principles of our Declaration of Independence and regimes that believe only in power. To meet this challenge, we need more than resolve. We need those countries which care about freedom and peace, about law and dignity, to work together. Most of them will be democracies. Some may not be. But what matters is that they are committed to a world not governed by intimidation and armed aggression. This coalition would include NATO, our Indo-Pacific allies, and also willing partners in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. It must be global in scope and strategic in purpose. We don't need unanimity, but we do need alignment around shared values and common concerns about threats. Some argue that America should step back, should withdraw. I believe the opposite. We must recommit ourselves to the same role we always played, to safeguard our people, protect freedom, and defend the world's fragile architecture of peace abroad, progress at home. That role has not expired. It has become, if anything, more essential. We can't do everything, but we cannot afford to do nothing. The world will not stabilize itself. And if America retreats, others, those who do not share our values, will move in to fill the void. Much later in his life, Abraham Lincoln articulated a global role for this country in his famous Gettysburg Address, where he pledged that this nation shall have, as he called it, a new birth of freedom, and as he said, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Thank you.
Wow, a lot to digest there. Very accomplished man. I want to start, before getting to some of Wolfowitz's comments, from a perspective of grand strategy, as I understand it. I think in this period of flux, it's clear that we do not have one, and I think that any American foreign policy that pursues the interests of Americans needs to, in fact, be balanced. The way I understand grand strategy is that the first step to making it is a circular two-part step, which is simultaneously analyzing what the world looks like and what are your threats, and then drawing, in proportion to what you're able to accomplish, what your interests should be. So I want to get your three opinions on what the world looks like right now. What is the structure of the international system? How is power distributed? Are we multipolar? Are we not there yet? And where are things headed in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
So who would you like? I can take a start at
Please.
that. Yes. Though I want to say I'm waving to Curt there. You know, we can see him. So thank you for joining us. I think one thing I would start with is when I think about grand strategy, I think about the definition. I can't remember who it was that defined it as such, but he said, a way to think about grand strategy is it's a vision of your place in the world. And so one way could be in the way that you defined it here, where you can say threats, look at resource, so forth. But the other way to think about it is, what is your place in the world? How do you define your place in the world? How do you understand it? And then act on that. And it's interesting in terms of the remarks we just heard. I was actually, when coming to this event, I was thinking about Washington's address, and that's definitely a place you can start. What's interesting is that Washington's address is often brought up as this notion of kind of an isolationist. The U.S. its role in the world is not to be entangled in the affairs of other nations, especially these crazy countries in Europe that are at war all the time, from his perspective, which I think was very well said. But what's interesting is the reason he says that is because the U.S. cannot be encumbered to go out to the world to actually bring about U.S. influence. And so the address is actually not an isolationist address. It's an address about that the U.S. has a role to play in the world, but the U.S. shouldn't be bogged down in the power political positions of other countries. And that's why he warns against the entangling alliances. And so for him, he did view the U.S. as having that role. Now, what's interesting is you can transport that forward, as much as I'd love to talk about Lincoln's view on this. I can come back to that. But you can transport that forward to thinking about probably the best, if you will, singular statement on that. Someone who, thanks to Professor Pape we had here not that long ago, which was Madeleine Albright. In the 1990s, 1998 specifically, she gave an address where she said the U.S. is the indispensable nation. And so because of that, that is the role that the U.S. should be playing. The role is it has to be involved everywhere all the time because it's the only one that can solve a crisis. Evidence of that recently in Pakistan and India, right? The U.S. playing a key role there. And so that says that the U.S., yes, it might have to balance threats with this, but from the Albright perspective, it is that the U.S.'s role in the world is to always try to be involved everywhere because that is what's going to hold the world together, to allow it to be hospitable to the United States. What I would end my portion of the remarks with is recently there's been a different statement on it. And that different statement is articulated by our current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And I think that, and what's interesting is Rubio, both in his address when he was going through his confirmation hearings, but also in interviews, he kind of hearkened to that same era that Madeleine Albright made those statements, which was the immediate post-Cold War era, saying that, well, yes, the U.S. was the unipolar power. He even said the U.S. is operating almost like it had to operate, or it could operate as almost like a world police force. He said, we're not in that world anymore. And what he said was, there's horrible things happening in the world. There are. And then there's horrible things happening in the world that are in the U.S. interest to address. And we need to be focusing on those. So it's a very different vision of what the U.S.'s role should be in the world. And again, I think I'm just bringing that up to kind of say that when I think about the grand strategic idea behind it, to me, it really is this tension between what Rubio is putting forward and what Madeleine Albright, going all the way back to Washington, has put forward. I don't have an answer to that right now, but hopefully this helps, setting some things on the table for us as we're going forward tonight.
It does. Professor Pape, I wanted to ask your opinion on that. Is the landscape still fertile to U.S. intervention everywhere at any time, or is it time to dial back a little bit?
Well, let me say a couple things. First, I'm delighted to be here. As Henry knows, I'm a big supporter of students in general and a big supporter of the audience out there, the under 40 folks who are watching us online. I think this could not be better. I also want to say, I am really glad Paul Wolfowitz spoke here. Many may not know, he got his PhD from our political science department in the early 1970s. So he was one of these young folks here at a certain point, and then he went off to try to, and did have a lot to run the world. Number three, I'm not just a professor. I've advised every White House since 9/11. That includes the Trump White House. I was Ron Paul's foreign policy advisor. I was Barack Obama's foreign policy advisor. There's a whole story behind that. So there's, when you're asking about, sort of how to talk about the world here, I really believe these kind of conferences are extremely important. I've always been a believer that we get ourselves into bad wars. So I've been opposed to a lot of the wars that we've been involved in the last 30 years. That said, I want to talk about where we are in the world. I think, yes, the Russians definitely want us to be in a multipolar world. The Chinese want us to be in a multipolar world. There's IR scholars saying that. We are still in the mature part of the unipolar world. The core to military power is economic power. The United States right now has 26% of the world's GNP. That is where we are. Yes, we are prime. We are number one. China is number two at 18%. Where is Russia? 4%. Okay, so let's just think about that for a moment. All right, so yes, we could say that this is becoming a multipolar world. Maybe we can talk about bipolarity, whether it's still stable or not, but we have not become a multipolar world. Now, if we, depending on our policies over the next 5 or 10 years, we can help Russia conquer Eastern Europe. And that is going to add to its GNP. And so we can double Russia's GNP over the next 5 or 10 years if we help Russia conquer Ukraine and then help Russia conquer some other parts. We can help China. China doesn't have to conquer. The Japanese and the South Koreans in the last month have thrown themselves at China economically. And so this is going to quickly equal America's 26% unless we are not careful. So you said, what is our strategic goal? For me, for 30 years, my goal here, which you don't maybe see in the academic books, is I'm a believer in primacy. I like the fact we are number one economically. I don't want to throw that away. I don't want to get involved in bad wars that throw that away. I also don't want to get involved in hastily dismantling and doing things that are going to only strengthen these emerging, but not yet, real competitors to the United States. So those are my real concerns, and I think we really need to think through over the next few years. And by the way, whatever happens with Trump and President Trump, I think this generation is going to be the generation that's really going to matter. You're going to be the ones who are going to determine whether we are going to have that place as number one in the world, or are we now really going to be like the British and we're just going to have to accept that, yes, exactly. It's your generation that's really going to have to make that call.
Lot to digest there. Mr. Mills, I've been thinking about what to ask you given that. We've heard a lot from our two professors here about the structure of the world system, and Professor Pape dipped into what the American goal should be. What should our strategic ends be? What should we be trying to do? I have two questions for you. First, do you agree or disagree, specifically with Professor Pape's description at the current trajectory of the world? Do American policies at the moment stand to hand Russia some more GNP and relegate us to a non-prime position? And secondly, do you agree with both professors' assessment on the structure of the world system? Do you think the United States is still as strong as Professor Pape says? Do you have a more pessimistic view? I'm curious.
To the extent that I fully understand the question, you guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
So I think I disagree, and perhaps quite strongly. So I think we're multipolar and in denial. I think we have seen that China can do all kinds of things at parity of the U.S., maybe on AI, which spooked Wall Street earlier this year, or better infrastructure, Belt and Road. The number of countries in our own backyard, Latin America, that are partners of the BRI should, give, I think, basically any serious American analyst a pause. China is clearly a pure economic competitor by GDP, so I'm not really sure what the argument is there. On Russia and Ukraine, Russia is obviously generally, a villain in the, alleged West. But I would say, look at the votes of the global South. And since it's in the air and, this week, look at the position of the Vatican, the largest church of the largest religion in the world. The U.S. is, not so much that hegemon politically as it thinks it is. And on Israel, Gaza, and Iran, The U.S. is an utter outlier and a shameful one at that. I think reputation matters, and I think our reputation is not strong. If this was a unipolar situation, I don't think the chessboard would look like this at all. And given that the unipolar world lasted for a very brief time, from 1991 to the collapse of the Soviet Union to 2008 with the global financial crisis, the U.S. made a huge mess of things, particularly in the 2000s. We obviously are not capable enough to handle it, nor should we particularly want the role. And I'll close on this. The British were referenced, but it wasn't like the British lost their position globally sort of randomly. They lost it by insane imperial overstretch, by getting involved in wars that they didn't need to do. And then they had to hand off the empire to their cousins out west. I think we should avoid the fate of the British by not repeating the mistakes of the British.
In light of the world you just described, may I ask, what do you think the United States should be trying to achieve, given what it is currently capable of? And do you think the administration's current actions reflect that position? Are we still too overextended? Do we need to draw back more?
Yeah, I mean, I think we still remain pretty tremendously overcommitted. I think the administration is going in the right direction. I think it's very clear that this team is superior in the kind of thing that I would want than the kind of thing that was promised by the Harris campaign in 2024. I mean, Harris closed her campaign by campaigning with Liz Cheney. I don't know what brain trust thought that was a smooth idea. It's very clear that administration would have seen a sort of merger of corporate and militaristic powers in Washington allied with social liberalism. This is a more, I would say, socially centrist administration that wants to look at this from a realist foreign policy perspective, but it's tough. And look, I'll agree with Paul Wolfowitz, at least here. The Americans were smart, actually. The state should work for its own citizens' lives, liberty, and their pursuit of happiness. And we should avoid entangling alliances abroad, as Washington warned his farewell. We can have a second American century, but we should do that by actually focusing on the Americas. So in that sense, the flag, the sort of designs on Greenland and Panama. I'll say this: it makes a lot more sense than invading Iraq, or particularly caring what government runs Iran. We take care of business here at home, 2 oceans, a ton of talented people. This is a much more dynamic place than Europe still, for all its flaws, and a much more free and young place than Asia. We do that, we'll win the competition with China hands down. If we do everything we just did for the last 30 years, we're doomed. We've got to invest here, and we've got to start sometime. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, Professor Pape, after listening to that, I'd love to direct a conversation to you, because I heard the word realism be said. Perhaps there's not yet a strategic doctrine established in Washington, or if there is, I don't think it would yet be classified.
Yes.
You know what I'm going to ask.
So let me just establish. So my goal is to keep the United States number one. In 1990, we were 22% of the world's GNP when the Cold War ended. 22% of the world's GNP. Our allies in Europe, Germany, and I'll use 92 numbers because I know you will check me out on this.
Right.
Okay. Germany was 8% of the world's GNP. Britain was 6% of the world's GNP. France was about 6, almost 6. Where are we today, 30 years later? We have the United States up to 26. We've grown by 20% of power since 1990. Where is Germany? They're down at 3%. Where is France? 3%. Where is Britain? 3%. So all of these folks who we're saying have been free riding and are freeloaders, if this is what it means to be Uncle Sucker, I'll be Uncle Sucker every day of the week. What we're doing, folks, is we are selling the world. We're basically realists with a velvet glove. What we're doing is gaining relative power with our allies. Where is Japan? Japan in 1990 was just over 10%. Where is Japan today? 5%. There is not an ally who has done better in relative GNP in the world than the United States. We have benefited more than anybody else. Now, it's possible, maybe we could come up with a plan, maybe it's Greenland. I'm not saying it's absolutely impossible, but what I want to hear is I want to hear a plan for real, which is we're going to declare economic warfare on our allies, basically become the Soviet Union, who disengaged from the world for 40 years during the Cold War. That's what sunk the Soviet Union. We're going to do that. We're going to follow the Soviet path, and then we're going to conquer Greenland and conquer Canada, and we're going to somehow have at least 26% of the world's GDP when by all said and done. Now, I want us to have at least 26 over the next 10 years. Warts and all, I don't like a lot of parts about this liberal international order. I'm not making the case as a liberal. I don't like a lot of parts of it. But what I want is that power. And what I want to hear for real is, you dump this, we're going to destroy this. I want to hear the real case for creative destruction. It's about, because right now, this is what's at odds, folks. And it's important for this generation, because in 2035, I want to have a metric that you can go back and look at. Pape said at least 26% of the world, right? So if the other side is going to do better, they've got to beat 26% of the world. Give me a plan.
So I'm gonna try to merge, to synthesize your perspective with that of Mr. Mills, if it's possible.
Yeah.
Mr. Mills, you paint a picture of a world where our adversaries are on the rise, and even if the numbers say one thing, it feels underlyingly that the relative ability of the West, if not just the US, to actually counteract these adversaries is reduced, and many people do not yet realize that. And Professor Pape, you painted a picture of a world that the Americans actually benefit from. Our GNP has gone up, or that of our allies has gone down. And now, Professor Poast, this is for you. I will not charge you with explaining what the administration is doing right now, but what I will say is, in this world, where it seems we're getting stronger, but the collective Western order's ability to actually get stuff done is clearly not where it was before, even if on paper the United States is doing better, what would your strategic doctrine for today be? If you were the head of the National Security Council and you were charged with drawing up that statement, what would your strategy be?
Well, first of all, I love already that we have an interesting contrast here between Curt and Bob. This is great. But what's interesting is, I kind of view it as we've got the different extremes here, because you have we are in the pure, complete multipolar world, which is kind of a way to is an argument that I've heard a lot, and I would kind of interpret Curt's view on it. You have, no, we are still very much in a unipolar world. That is very much the view that was expressed by Bob. We have I kind of view it as, we are in a multipolar world, but we're in an unequal multipolar world. I think there are certain countries that have reached the level of being considered great powers. They have the influence. They have to be contended with. And then what that means is, and that's very much in contrast to that time when Madeleine Albright made the indispensable nation comment, that during the 1990s, I would even go as far as say unipolar moment really maybe only lasted about a decade. Not even by 2008, I think it was already, the pure height of the unipolar moment, I think was already have been in decline, especially when you go into start looking at other metrics and some of the policies. Actually, I would agree with some of what Curt said. Some of the policies that were sowing the discontent that people eventually have with their policies there. So what does that mean? What that means is, if we're in an unequal multipolarity, it means the U.S. does still have the ability to influence the world, but it doesn't have all the ability. It can't be everywhere, do everything all at once. So it does still have to make decisions, and it still has to be able to say, is this in our interest to become involved with? I think that was the folly of the Bush administration. I think that was the folly, potentially, of even the Clinton administration, of thinking, hey, you know what, we can go around and try to fix everything. You even saw that with Obama at the beginning of his administration, thinking we're still in this position. And it was interesting, recently I was at a conference with a bunch of international law professors. And actually, I did not realize the extent to which international law professors just do not like the Libya invasion, do not like the Libyan campaign. They're like, this was a terrible idea. We should have never have gotten involved with that at all. But that is the kind of policy that when you think you can go around and solve everything, you do. So the U.S. should not be pursuing that. It should be more judicious. I do think there is merit to trying to make sure allies can do more. The thing is, though, that's actually not a new refrain. If there's one thing about the Trump policy that is pretty much mainstream, it is getting free-riding European allies to do more, right? And so I think there's something to that. And if the Trump administration is actually able to get European allies to do more in Europe, I think that will be valuable for the reasons that I actually agree with Hegseth when he said we have a peer competitor in China. We have to allocate more of our resources there. They're the bigger threat. Europe, you are our ally. You are actually capable of standing up to Russia. And if on your own, with us supporting you, but not necessarily needing to lead. So I do think that we are in a world where it's an unequal multipolarity. The U.S. is still powerful, but it's not all powerful. And so I do think it's in the U.S. interest to be able to have our allies do more, but still have them as allies. And that's the one risk, is that do you go so far in pushing your allies to do more that you end up losing them as allies? That's a balance that needs to be struck. I'm not sure the current administration is striking that balance. And we can come back to that point.
Well, that brings us a little bit to the conversation of means and instruments. Allies. I feel like we tend to forget, no matter your belief, that alliances are not the end in and of themselves. They're the instrument. And you bring up the need to push allies, don't push them too hard or else you'll lose them. That has the implicit comment that we should want to keep our allies. May I ask, to what ends? If the current order is being pulled down on top of our heads, which I think the administration is doing, what comes next? Do you want alliances who help you protect freedom of navigation, or are you just concerned with the Elbridge Colby type of regional balance of power? What's your desired end state in the current world?
So one way that I would look at this, and I find this quite ironic in many ways. So I have been on record, and I've said this many times, that Donald Trump is going to be a great 19th century president. The challenge is he's going to be a 19th century president in a 21st century world. But the reason why I say that is, first of all, I think that if he was in this room, he wouldn't take that as an insult at all. He has been very vocal about William McKinley is the greatest president ever. But I think when he says great again, he thinks about how the U.S. was in that 1890 period to the early 20th century period of growing, expanding. He refers to those type of things. That's what he has in his mind when he sees that. Now, what's interesting is that as the U.S. started to emerge into that role, the U.S. started to become more and more engaged in the global economy, more central to the global economy. And what that had the inevitable effect of is it meant the U.S., despite wanting to do otherwise, couldn't stay out of two big wars in Europe. The U.S. tried to stay out of them and couldn't because it was in our interest to prevent those wars from happening. Same thing with big wars in Asia. Of course, I'm referring to World War I, World War II. The U.S. became involved with those, and it was because it was out of necessity. What does that have to do with the Allies? It has to do with the following, that if I was to ever give a briefing to a president, and that would include President Trump, I would only need one slide. And that slide would just be one picture. And that picture would be the U.S. cemetery in Normandy. And I'd say, Mr. President, if you want to avoid more of these in the future, that's why we need allies. Because the last time the U.S. tried not to do that, a lot of chaos broke out, and the U.S., despite wanting otherwise, wasn't able to stay out of that chaos. And so anything we can do to prevent that type of chaos is in U.S. interest.
So if I'm to draw out what you're saying here, it's that the United States, although maybe we're not indispensable, still needs to be in certain regions because our absence would produce the type of war that we would have to intervene in.
Exactly. And I think it's been a mistake throughout our history to think that the U.S. can just stay out of the fray.
And that's a very realist structuralism. Mr. Mills, you used the word realism before, and I actually come to agree with your take that I think a lot of people don't realize just how reduced Western power is. Even if on paper it should be there, something's wrong with the way that we actually create power. That actually concerns me even more, because when I look at a country like China, I see a country that could actually remake the system to our incredible, I don't know the word I'm looking for here. It'd be a really big problem. So I'm wondering your perspective on balancing the need to basically retrench, focus more on us at home, but also at a time when it seems like China's rise demands American attention. What is your perspective on what we should do there?
Well, first of all, I'm not even certain anymore that the quote West is a thing. I think it's a fairly modern construct, and if you look at China's abroad. I mean, European countries that are ostensibly in the West are very game to do business with the Chinese historically. Israel, which is ostensibly in the West, is very game to do business with the Chinese historically. So I'm not so convinced that it's a very useful construct. I think it's the kind of construct that makes us divide the world into black and white. You know, it hasn't really served us in the Middle East. It hasn't served us in the Russia-Ukraine war, and I think we should trash the template. I agree that this administration, Trump is very much a 19th century president, but I'm not so sure, that it's actually so irrational. The first, the person that was flagged, McKinley, is very much the sort of cause célèbre of this administration of this term, but the one of the previous term, the portrait that sat behind the president on that side in the Oval Office was Andrew Jackson, and I think it's it's apropos. The U.S. in antebellum was an exciting but also pessimistic place. There's actually a great new book out that talked about how most of the American founders died in the 1810s and 1820s had actually thought their country and their life's work had been a failure. I mean, we really underestimate the degree to which America was on the fritz throughout the 19th century, the degree to which countrymen disliked and distrusted one another. I think there's like this view that this 20th century sort of rescued us from all of that, from that mire. And look, there's some truth to that, but I don't concede that it was this architecture of the 20th century that did it, as opposed to natural American strength. I don't think, for instance, all those European entanglements were an interest. Certainly not World War I. Woodrow Wilson ran a frankly criminal campaign in 1916, lying to the American people about staying out of the war, and then went back in. Economic numbers, I mean, we can trade them all day, but I think if we are 26% of the world's economic output, and we are a bureaucratic, oligarchic, gerontocratic system, I think that economic growth is not the end all and be all. I mean, I just looked during the remark what the U.S. It's not the only measure of this, but what the U.S.'s Gini coefficient is, right? The measure of economic inequality. We're, as of 2023, the 40th highest in the world. I mean, there's not a country that looks like ours with this kind of level of inequality. We're peers with Haiti. I don't think we can police the whole world, and I don't think the American people want to police the whole world. We're over $30 trillion in debt. This debt's going to be borne by young people. Not clear when, but it's going to happen. And we've arguably not achieved our political objectives in any major military operation since World War II. I think Iraq War II wipes out the relative success of Iraq War I. And until very recently, supermajorities, often 70% plus, think the U.S. is heading in the wrong direction. Like most developed economies, the U.S. is well below replacement birth rate. That's the ultimate referendum on the future in our current course. But contra Europe, where this started in the decades earlier, particularly Italy in the 70s, the careening of the birth rate in the U.S. has been a recent phenomenon, a 21st century phenomenon. Not coincidentally when the U.S. began being involved in new wars in a major way for the first time since Vietnam, and not coincidentally when the millennials came of age, my generation, the first generation in American history that is broadly expected to do worse on average than their parents. It has been a short, bad, strange trip, and I think we should end it.
So we have problems at home. That much is clear. May I get, before I pitch this to Professor Pape, where, in your opinion, do we absolutely need to be in the world? What regions? Mr. Mills.
Is this for me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I mean, sorry, I thought you said Professor Pape. I apologize. So I think the U.S., I think the Monroe Doctrine is sound. I think, if the U.S. has primacy in the Americas, that is justifiable in ensuring the security of American people. I think if we focus on the Americas and reshore our historic ties to a lot of countries and build back our reputation globally as a proponent of peace, diplomacy, and freedom, the kind of reputation that we had in the 1950s after World War II, I think we will win the competition of China without firing a shot and going away. If the U.S. tries to bully and coerce everybody into its system while basically running out of gas here at home, I think we will be a pariah and we will lose. So I prefer to be popular and win.
Okay. Professor Pape, what do you think of the Fortress Americana strategy?
So I think that, again, my goal is to keep the United States number one. And I think that, for example, if we were to fix our domestic problems, but the United States were to lose half of its GNP, so we were only 15% of the world's GNP, I don't believe the blue-collar folks that support President Trump would be very happy. So I don't think that's going to be the future here. Let me lay out what I think would be a much better future that will also solve the problem, or at least begin to touch on the issue of the domestic issue here, because I do believe you have to address both, and I believe this is what you have to do to speak to President Trump. I think realists like, us, Paul Mearsheimer, he's not paying attention. It's because of what Curt's talking about. This is, I think, being fundamentally driven by domestic politics here. So here's what I think. Number one, the biggest challenge to middle America, of course, is Chinese manufacturing. So let's just, number one, focus on that which is also the peer competitor problem. So these are twofer, you get a twofer right there. Number two, let's have a 5-year plan where what we're gonna do is we're meeting with the Chinese today, so if anybody's listening, okay, we're gonna have a 5-year plan where we're gonna go back to not 80% tariffs the way President Trump floated yesterday, but 20% tariffs with a schedule. We're going to cancel all the tariffs on everybody else in the world. It's only going to be China. And we're going to say each year for the next 5 years, we're going to go from 20 to 40, And then we're going to take that money that we get from those Chinese tariffs, and we're going to put them in the robotics revolution in St. Louis, in Kansas City, in Kentucky. We're going to actually create not money for Silicon Valley, okay, and not just money to pay down the deficit. So what we need to actually invest in the forgotten men and women who should be forgotten no more. That is President Trump and J.D. Vance. Well, let's actually do that. So this is what I meant by let's have a plan. Let's actually have a plan. Let's not just say, we're just going to declare war on everybody, we're going to do all this on everybody, we're going to break everything, and 10 years from now we'll sort it out. No, we know what the issues are. We know where President Trump's constituency is. By the way, I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania. I got J.D. Vance's background in DNA. I know what it's like to live that kind of a life. I had a nicer mother, I'd want to say. So no offense, but I had a great mom. That's how I'm here. Okay. But the bottom line is, I want the Rust Belt to regenerate. I want all that. We need an actual strategic plan, and we've got to stop talking and stop playing politics as if this is like, oh, if you're against anything President Trump says, you must be one of those liberals who wants Madeleine Albright world where you're talking about indispensable nation and so forth. No, this is a discussion we should have among conservatives and the middle of the country. That's who's going to run the country for the next 2, if not 4 years. So let's make America truly, dare I say, great again.
I knew where you were going with this.
So we are now thoroughly in a discussion of means. Your best mean is tariff China, although not as extremely as now. Continue to work with the world, and we'll keep our power.
And a sliding schedule of tariffs on China, and funnel that money into the middle of America for the robotics revolution, where terrified China is going to beat us at.
Yes, and Mr. Mills, your strategy is basically we do not need to be around the world. If we have fantastic economic, political, and cultural engagement with the Western Hemisphere, American industriousness should be able to carry us along. Correct?
Sure. I think, look, we have an imperial presidency, so the easiest thing to do is foreign policy. So I think that the item number one for any president, including this one, is we got to roll back the empire. It's an empire that is not serving the imperial subjects. So that's the easiest. I broadly support the administration's tariff strategy. I'm sure it can be improved upon. I think it's going to be improved upon in the weeks to come. But I think that's sound. And then additionally, I think the immigration compact in this country is utterly broken. The border has been insecure for decades, and particularly in the last 3 years. And I think we need to have a real conversation, not only about illegal immigration, which is disruptive in one capacity, but also legal migration, which the U.S. basically never voted on. It was done in the 60s, all the things, most of the things that people could happen were dismissed by the leaders who signed it. They did come to pass. There were serious immigration debates in California in the 90s. And California was a far more purple state. It voted for George H.W. Bush in '88. They voted overwhelmingly for a series of sort of, English first, assimilationist kind of programs. The courts threw them out. The U.S. populace never voted for any of this. And so a conversation of that strikes me as pretty germane. And I mean, look, this stuff is not new, even though a lot of people, especially a lot of American elites, are often not terribly informed. I know MAGA is voguish this year in the way that like BLM and COVID was voguish in 2021, 2020, but there has been a raft of literature that criticized globalism since at least the 70s and 80s. And, foreign policy restraint, immigration restriction, trade realism, and then also recognizing that we had a disintegrating working class. Why did we have a disintegrating middle class? And we need to approach that now. So yeah, focus at home. I just think, we need to intervene now before it's too late. And I worry that there is actually, I think everybody on this panel is bright, but my greatest fear is that there's such a generational gulf in lived experience that it will take decades more for us to grapple with this reality.
So there's a big gulf here between the means that you and Professor Pape prescribe. I'm wondering, because the ends is relatively the same, revitalize America, keep our power. I'm wondering if there is an inherent difference in perspective between the two of you on what should take priority. You clearly prioritize the remaining of our international economic ties. Drop the sanctions on every country, keep them on China. The implicit assumption there is our ties with the world are still important. And Mr. Mills is very fine with let's keep us in the Western Hemisphere. Professor Poast, I've spoken a lot with you on this, the value of alliances, on the continued connection we have with allies, partners, and maybe quasi-aligned states. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing that your opinion is more on our continued engagement with this vast network of states that we have built is important. I'm wondering what you're thinking, where you fit in this debate.
No, it's interesting because there's a lot of the criticisms and even criticisms that Curt was pointing to, I think are very sound. I think it's to me, the unipolar moment fed into quite a bit of hubris, right? And you saw that with the notion of what they would call the Washington consensus policies, right? We're going to go around, we're going to open up everything. There was the belief that the reason why China needs to be brought into the World Trade Organization, or we need to establish permanent normal trade relations with China, wasn't so much just thinking about the economics. It was the thought that will lead China to become democratic. Right? It was this notion of, I think Ian Bremmer said it very well, which was, we thought we could make China into Americans. And it turned out China wants to be Chinese, right? And it's like, but we were mistaken with this. So I think there was a lot of folly in this thought in terms of pursuing, as people like to say, neoliberal economic policies globally. And then also at the same time seeking military primacy, which was very much a policy that the US had. And then adopting that and using it in a way to say we are not just going to deem ourselves the indispensable nation, which means we need to be involved and we need to play a part, but to actually be like, we're going to go around and we're going to use U.S. military muscle in a way that maybe is not even prudent, right? But it's because of this sense that we have to go about doing this, or we have the ability to go about doing this, or we have the power. So I do think that there's a lot to this. The U.S. unipolarity led to hubris that led to policies that alienated folks by leading to forever wars and alienated folks by leading to economic inequality and so forth. There's a great paper that was written in Foreign Affairs several years ago by Bob Keohane and Jeff Colgan. And Bob Keohane is someone that in the 1990s was arguing all about global institutions are great and so forth. He wrote this paper, and it was in, I think, 2016, 2017, titled "The Global Order is Rigged." And it was all about these things that people in the working class areas have been left behind by these policies that were pursued. So that is to preface to say that there's absolutely this view that the U.S., if anything, didn't rely on its allies enough. The U.S. went around thinking, we can go around and do everything ourselves. We can pursue this policy, that policy. And even if our allies are not quite comfortable with it, we're just going to convince them to do it. So if anything, I would argue that the U.S. needs to be a better ally than it has been for the past 30 years by actually working cooperatively with allies rather than dictating terms to our allies, which is a lot of what the U.S. was actually doing during the unipolar moment. Recall that the Iraq War was not just something that seemed to be popular at the time, at least among senators and members of Congress, but it was not popular internationally.
No.
And the U.S. was like, nope, we don't care. Our NATO allies were very much opposed to it. We were like, nope, we don't care. So if anything, what I'm calling for is the U.S. needs to be a better ally by actually respecting our allies, working cooperatively with our allies, and doing that more so than maybe what we've done in the past 30 years.
I agree with that. If I may, I agree with that. I mean, we would have been better off in 2003 listening to the German and the French than basically our foreign policy establishment, all due respect to one of our panelists who gave the pre-recorded video. But I will also say, though, I think there's a dual risk with alliances. I mean, all you have to do is binge hours and hours and hours and hours of World War I documentaries on YouTube to learn the risks of alliances. And so I think Russia, Ukraine, the kind of thing that we're talking about, Article 5 protection, NATO protection for Ukraine, permanent security architecture in Eastern Europe, American troops, even the minerals deal that the Trump administration is trying to get through or has signed, the idea that we would have American personnel trying to get a mine in a war zone working, that all strikes me as tripwires for something very, very, very dangerous. So I think we can listen to our friends and our historical partners. The French are right on Iraq, and they were right on the founding of this country, but we can do that without signing a bunch of paper.
Professor Pape, you want to get
well, I like the consensus that's emerging. But I make 2 points here. One is, I think it's really important to point out that becoming weaker doesn't make you smarter. So the Brits, I just told you, became a lot weaker. Well, they still did this war with Argentina, which, what was that all about? And now we've got Starmer and Macron, both of whom are weaker in the last 30 years, talking about, well, let's stick their noses deeper into Ukraine in ways that could escalate nuclear war. So too, this is not exactly, so I just want to point out, number one, becoming a weaker America doesn't mean becoming a smarter America. The best way to do that, it really does depend on the leadership we elect. And I think that that's, and I like restraint. So I am from the restraint in terms of force. The second point I want to make is, and this gets back to the importance of your point, Henry, about grand strategy. Quite clear, President Trump has been elected on two dimensions of a revolution, I would say. One is a revolution in domestic politics. Now, of course, the opposite side, the Democrats don't like that. Another is a revolution in international foreign policy. But we need to look at the last time we thought about this was after World War II. After World War II, we had 50% of the world's GNP. Thank you for nodding, Paul. That means that you're fact-checking.
Yep.
50% of the world's GNP for almost 10 years. So we could really kind of tabula rasa restructure American society and restructure the world in fundamental ways. We can disagree about the warts and so forth, but fundamentally, we had the power to be able to do both of those missions expansively at the same time. We're at 26% of the world's GNP, folks. We're not at 50% of the world's GNP. I'm not saying don't make changes. I just laid out for you a program of grand strategy to stitch the domestic revolution with the foreign policy revolution together in a tight way. And I believe that's required because we're at 26% of the world's GNP. It's not an ideological statement. This is a statement about what do you do with America's power to make America stronger in the future. And I think you're going to need this kind of grand strategic thinking. And this is just, I don't think it's impossible that the Trump administration could evolve to this. I do think, though, they need to hear this kind of discussion, not just more, oh yeah, let's keep talking about how good or bad our allies are and just calling them names or not. I think this is just not helpful for us going forward.
Thank you for that. So I will say, more consensus arose here than I thought I'd be able to get. And I think that if we were to fully flatten everything out, it would
It's
probably
due to
take-
your outstanding moderation.
Absolutely.
I think we would probably need a few more hours than we have to even out all the bumps. So with that, I'd like to open up Q&A to the audience. Please.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Mill, Professor Pape, and Professor Poast, and Henry for fantastic moderation as well. I had a question in regards to a point Professor, I believe, Poast had brought up, and that was the U.S. working more cooperatively with their allies. In 2022, I believe Macron went to Beijing and had tea with President Xi in the Winter Garden and spoke about decoupling with American, more so trying to spread their alliances broadly around the world. And I believe yesterday as well, he signed a security pact, so to say, with Poland, with the idea of Poland joining the French nuclear umbrella. But how do you negotiate the idea of our other great allies, and who are also great powers in their own right, wanting to cooperate with the U.S. when you have their leaders also making initiatives and moves such as that? And as well, I mean, that has a cascading effect, because if Poland's under the security umbrella of France, and France is under our security umbrella with NATO, then therefore the backstop is still technically us, the American people.
Well, there's a couple answers to that. I mean, first one is some of those moves that are made by Macron are in response to the U.S. currently not being perceived as a good ally. Having said that, it's also important to always say that there's a French fixed effect, if you will, when it comes to U.S. alliance relations, which is we can, with the exception of the Revolutionary War, I think we can trace out many instances in history where the French have been more problematic and the U.S. and the French have not gone along well. In fact, it's important to remember that the only country to actually, as much as they talk about, will Trump pull us out of NATO or will he not, the only country that's actually ever left NATO was France, of course, under de Gaulle. Now, he didn't leave the military he left the military apparatus. They didn't stop signing as a signatory of the treaty. But, the U.S. and France itself have always had these issues. France has long called for trying to create like a European army, not because of the idea that that's going to make us a stronger ally, but because they want France to be the ones who are muscling the other European allies around. They don't want the U.S. to be the one muscling other European allies around. And so the option is you either just say, well, look, we just need to muscle France harder. Or what we could say is we could offer our other allies, like, well, look, if you want to be pushed around by France, that's fine, because that's clearly what they want to do, and good luck with that. Or, you know what, we'll work with you on things. But I think right now the perception is, and hence Poland moving towards this, other countries taking seriously the idea that maybe we need to rely on the French nuclear umbrella or the British one, is to say, we're not sure that the U.S. would actually want to have our back anymore. And so I think that part of it is it's exactly because we're not working cooperatively with these allies.
Hey everyone, I'm Christopher. Thanks so much for a great panel. I'd like to address something that Professor Pape said, but then potentially open it up to you and then to the rest of the group. You had shared in the beginning and a couple of times that your goal is primacy for the United States. Your desire is for the U.S. to remain number one. And of course, I don't not want that. I would love for that.
And
to
a
be the
democracy.
case. Fair enough, certainly. But I believe that it may be an imprecise goal, actually. I think to the credit of former Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, he said the goal for 200 years of this country's foreign policy has been to protect its citizens and to promote their welfare. And so there is probably a lot of synergy between those two goals, but I think actually that's probably a more prescient and specific goal. It really should support the American people. Now, in terms of being involved internationally, I think there's definitely a range, and Curt Mills brought up, of course, we want in the Western Hemisphere to be dominant. That's obvious just for geographical reasons and whatnot. But I think of Russia and Ukraine. We've spent probably north of $150 billion on that conflict. And you can get into the minutiae of what that money that is, but that's a lot of money that we've spent. And the question is, what has it gotten us in the direction of that goal of looking out for the welfare and for the human flourishing in this country. I think that's the most important goal, and so I wonder how you square those.
Yeah, so for the last 5 years, I've been spending almost 80% of my time on American political violence, not international political violence or international things the way I have for my entire career. And the reason is because I do believe, as you said, the number one issue for our country is whether we are going to be a country 5 or 10 years from now. Now, I wrote a long piece in Foreign Affairs. So Curt, you may be interested in this. Paul knows about this. Others may be. But I published it in November and December of last year. It's a 5,000-word piece. It lays out all my thinking about this. But here's the number one thing, and here's why Ukraine is a teeny tiny part of this. It is an issue, but it's much smaller. What I lay out here, and this comes from all our quarterly surveys of political violence in the United States, focus groups. So this is not just a small, coming this by with just writing an op-ed. This represents years and years of millions of dollars of research. The bottom line is that I think what people are missing is we are going through a demographic shift in this country. For the first time in our 250-year history, we're shifting from a white majority democracy to a white minority democracy. That is the big structural change that is impacting our country. This accounts for, if you look at the details of exactly when, I could go through the numbers, this timing is almost perfect with the meteoric rise of Donald Trump. Why immigration is the central issue. Why Donald Trump in 2024 did something nobody else was expecting. He built more of a multiracial coalition on the basis of religion and blue collar than anybody else was expecting. Why? They hadn't read Sam Huntington 2004, Who We Are. And I don't know if Donald Trump read that book, but somebody figured out, maybe Susie Wiles, somebody figured out what's inside of these arguments about how you could navigate this shift here from the right. And this was in line with Sam Huntington's thinking. Now, this is why each election we've been going through is getting more and more and more violence, and has been for the last 5 years. The 2026, probably more violent than we've had before, and this will probably go on for another 10 years. Now, yes, there are connections here with Ukraine, relations with Putin, and so forth. But the truth is, I believe these are the relatively minor issues here in terms of the reshaping of American identity and what's at the core of this. We're going through a once, not in a generation, not in a lifetime, a once in a country's history of redefining America's identity or not. And that's happening right now with this generation. And that's what's underneath all of the tension in our politics that's making it not just polarized, and we're not just having TikTok wars, we're actually having real violence here, and it's happening on college campuses, against CEOs. All of this is interconnected. And this is what's going to be why President Trump, I really believe, needs to basically have 80% of his time focused on the United States of America here as we go forward, not 80% as most presidents do with foreign policy, international, or taking Greenland or not. That's all going to be out there, but the fundamental issue we have in front of us, folks, is America itself. And this is not something that we should be just taking for granted.
I'm going to kind of go back to Mr. Mills' point about you questioning even the existence of the West. When we think about our alliances, we typically think of shared values of a sort. I know Mr. Vance has talked about how Europe has become more authoritarian, betraying a lot of the values that used to connect us.
Yes.
It seems as American domestic politics becomes more polarized, the left and right moving to different sides, isn't the only way to really have an American grand strategy would be to have enough domestic political capital for one vision to be able to think beyond 4-year terms? And is that perhaps not an argument for a more fortress America dynamic so that we can have a peace dividend for real so that we can focus domestically, given that any sort of pragmatic international order is going to be able to flip so dynamically based off domestic politics and who's the president, because I'm sure Donald Trump probably prefers nationalist leaders versus kind of the modern European leaders. Doesn't that inherent instability, if the desire for a grand strategy exists, maybe lend itself to a Fortress America foreign policy?
So I like a lot of J.D. Vance's positions. I think his positions on restraint, hillbilly elegy, I just told you a very similar background here. But his speech on February 14th of this year, everybody should go read it. That's the speech he gave in Munich. And that's the speech where he effectively, and this is how all the European leaders heard it, is called for regime change in Western Europe. Now, if you want to take on yet another mission, okay, so look at what you're describing. I'm explaining we're only 26% of the world's GDP. We have a problem with Russia in the world. We have a problem with China, which is arguably even more important in the world. So I'm telling you, we have a domestic problem that's the biggest of all. Now you want to take on, we should actually kill the EU as a total policy? Well, even if you don't like the EU, or I mean, if you want to do that, then you're going to have to forget about ending the war in Ukraine. You're going to have to forget about what you're going to do with China as number one. You're going to have to forget, because if you're really going to decide you're taking down the EU, then you have to do what Vance was doing. You have to meet with the AfD. You have to meet with the far-right parties. You have to actually empower the far-right parties here. You have to fix the problems with Le Pen in France. These are not small things, sir. So I would just simply say, we have to, because we're only 26% of the world's GDP, we need to have an actual strategy, not just say, gee, here's a list of 20 things. They would all be like kind of on our wish list of things that we would like from our position here. I'm saying that we're past that point. I have some priorities. I've just talked about the domestic ones, the international ones, and I'm sorry, wrecking the EU is just like way too far down on the list here.
I think that's, if I may, I think that's respectfully just an inversion of what the vice president said. Not to just super play up that I'm in Washington, but like if you do have any of these embassies, the Europeans, it is just complaining that the U.S. is going to leave NATO, complaining that the U.S. is going to withdraw from the Ukraine war, complaining that the U.S. is pulling out. And I think all Vance basically said is like, look, it's not even clear that we even agree on fundamental things anymore. Like, for instance, our administration just won in part because there was a threat or perceived threat to free speech here at home, and there are draconian speech laws throughout Europe. And if we're really going to be arm in arm all the way to the Donbass on these perceived values, perhaps the values should be more in unison. I think that's really all he remarked on. And then, summarily in the weeks and months since, the Germans have talked about banning the off day. The French have talked about, disqualifying Marine Le Pen. I think he's really making a point that do we really want to be in alliance with a group that may or may not share our values? They're going to be enemies with Europe, but we have all types of commitments to the Europeans right now, and they are going in a very different direction than us, and I think it's worth consideration. To the questioner's actual point, I agree wholeheartedly with what I believe he said. It sounds like the professor here knows a lot more about political violence in the last 5 years than I do, but I would observe, actually, that it hasn't been a clear line. The democratic reaction to Trump's victory in 2016, 17, 18 was far more histrionic and emotional than what occurred in 2024. There has been nothing like the Women's March. There's nothing, it could happen. There's been nothing like BLM. There's been nothing like Russiagate. And then, of course, the right-wing reaction to the Republican defeat in 2020, there's been nothing like that happened in 2022. So if anything, this is an opportunity, from my perspective, that we are having a relative cooling off point for a more cohesive national identity. And I just hope the administration doesn't squander that opportunity, because I do think it will get worse in the future if we don't seize it. There is elements, of course, of hypocrisy in every administration. The free speech mantra of this administration could be easily threatened by trying to enforce, quote, alleged anti-Semitism laws on campuses that I think are basically grounded in interest group lobbying that makes the Republicans look like utter hypocrites. And I think they should be very careful with that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear that we are at a sort of jumping off point. And if Trump is a success, we could see two candidates that look very much in the mold. I mean, I think the Democratic politics is actually pretty malleable. Trump in 2016 was an outlier in terms of hawkishness on China, and was an outlier in terms of the need for U.S. industrial policy. And by 2020, the Democrats invited and had copied him.
I agree. I thank you for those comments, sir, and I thank the three of you for coming on this panel. This is it. I want to thank you all for coming. And
Thank you. And Henry, you did a fantastic job. Give it up for Henry. Give it up for Henry.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Good job.
Chris, thanks
Hey, that
for
was
putting this
fun.
together.
That was fun.